From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. I'm very happy now to welcome Elena Miller Ter-Kuile. She is a sixth-generation farmer working on land that's been in her family since 1867 in southern Colorado, Cactus Hill Farms. Along with her father, she raises sheep for both wool and grass-fed meat, as well as organic grains, hay, and other products. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thank you.
So tell us a bit about the history of your family farm. What were they doing in previous generations, and how similar or how different is it to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so my family history, my Hispano family history is basically they've been moving through New Mexico, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, up into Domandi, New Mexico. And then when it was still part of Mexico, the Mexican government wanted to create strong relations with their northern settlers. So they opened up this part of Colorado to homesteaders. And that was when my family came into the area. And then, of course, after the Mexican-American War, this territory was lost to Mexico and became part of the United States. So I always say they didn't cross the border crossed them, and they stayed in the same place and became American citizens.
Right.
I think there's definitely some strong history through that time of how the generations kind of experienced being from maybe a different background and how that looked. So lots of stories from my grandmother and how that looked and how language and culture and all those things, whether people assimilated or kept fighting to be unique and separate culturally. And so my family actually had sheep back in the day. My great-great-grandfather, he was a very wealthy man, and he had his sheep that he brought into the San Luis Valley from northern New Mexico. And when he was just a kid, I guess they herded the sheep up over the mountains and into the new territory. So my family were sheep people. When my dad took over, he, back in the day, according to him, it was just really hard because we just didn't have like the veterinary science behind sheep management, and he just emotionally, he hated losing animals. And so he sold the sheep when I was about 5 years old. And so historically, it's been kind of a ranch and a farm, both, and different land uses, crop production, cattle for a little while. And then when I went off to school, I told him, I want to come back and farm. And he looked at me like, really? You really want to do this to yourself? And so I came back and convinced him to buy some sheep, which I don't know. I still don't know if he thinks is a good idea, but here we are. So that's kind of how the history of the farm has been. And it's been in my family kind of inherited, but also sold, and just different ways of passing it through the generations. Currently, I'm working on buying the farm from my dad, just because I think inheritance can be a little bit complex between family members. And I kind of saw that with my dad's generation. So we're learning as we go, I guess.
You're in the process of restoring your land after some serious degradation of the land, of the soil. How did that happen, and what kinds of restoration are you doing?
Yeah, so unfortunately, historically, we're also learning, like, as a culture, I think, but there were several things that happened. One of them was in the 1970s, 1980 era, the NRCS had programs for flood irrigation, because that's traditionally what was done by the acequia owners here. Was basically you have a ditch and then you dam the ditch with like a canvas dam, and then you siphon tubes to irrigate. It's a quote inefficient system. I would say in quotes very importantly, because it is inefficient in that a lot of the water basically goes into the ground and then goes down into the aquifer, and so plant use is less. And so, it is labeled as an inefficient system, but, it's complex, right? Because all that water that is not being used by the plants goes back into the aquifer and recharges the aquifer, and also creates other ecosystems like sub for trees and irrigation for wildlife. And so I think that term is very complex. But basically, back in the 70s, 80s, they recommended, okay, well, we'll level the fields. And then that way people can easily flood irrigate, because the natural topography of the ground is not flat. And so basically what they did is they took all the topsoil and pushed it to the one side so that the fields would be flat. And so in addition to that, I think there's the natural environment that we're in. We are a desert, and we also have very young soils. So our soils are mostly alluvial, which means they're created by river systems. river deposits, like over time, think about like a river meandering, and it picks up soil and picks up rocks, and then it deposits the soil or the rocks as it moves and changes directions. And so those soils are very young. They haven't like had that building process of organic matter and plant growth. And so they can be very marginal soils, but that is also just a natural system. So we have man-made, and then we also have, a soil that is very young and very depleted simply because we live in the desert and there isn't that return of organic matter through plant growth. And also, of course, the dryness of a desert does not help with any of that. So then there's that. And then there was also some other really destructive things. There was a big mining disaster on the headwaters of our river. And there was also a river straightening project that was done with the Army Corps of Engineers. And so basically, the mining disaster just destroyed the water quality, killed all the fish life, and we had a lot of contamination like on our soils because we're using the river water to irrigate. And so that's been a real challenge, especially even with livestock, because we do actually get like toxicity levels high enough that they can like kill animals. Just from animals eating the soil or eating the grass, they can actually get toxic levels of certain metals. And so that's been a real challenge, especially even on the human side of, drinking water and water quality for this community. And then also on the ag side of making sure that, these soils aren't getting so contaminated with these metals. And the river straightening also contributed to that because they basically took a span of the river and made it, instead of curvy and nice like a river's supposed to be, they made it straight and efficient. And that was the thought process like in the 1970s, that rivers should be straight because it's like efficient delivery of water. And then it just created a whole bunch of erosion and also contributed to that water quality issue because you're taking out all those beautiful riparian areas and trees and grasses, and all of those filter out contaminants. And suddenly, you have a dead river that basically doesn't have those curves and meanders and wetlands and riparian areas to filter out the water. So it's been several things. And so the first thing we've been doing is we have been working really hard on the river part because, that kind of came first. We did some massive restoration work and also worked on trying to get the mining disaster cleaned up, working through kind of more policy and government involvement. That's not me, but my father and my mother, so the previous generation. And then working on some river restoration projects. And I've been working on a lot of tree planting and trying to create like more wetlands because those wetlands really do help to clean up the water quality. And right now we're kind of on the next step of the farm has been a farm, mostly crops. And as I take over, I'm converting it more to a ranch. And so that'll be a lot of using, the sheep pasturing and also the manure and all the things that the sheep create to restore the soil and kind of bring back that topsoil that has been destroyed, or really a lot of places they didn't have topsoil to begin with. So I think that's kind of my journey. That's my background in soil science. And so I'm excited to kind of begin that process. And we have seen some improvements on some of our fields. We have one field that was like, I think about 1% organic matter, and we're already up to like 3.6. So that is hopeful. And I'm excited to see if I can kind of use that model throughout the farm and really kind of help our farm to get into the next generation in a really healthy way. Plus, I want to plant a lot of trees because we don't have a lot of them, and it would be cool to see some more trees growing along the river and along the ditches and stuff, the acequias.
How do you choose what trees to plant?
Yeah, that's a real tough one because I think I've seen like where there's that model of like, oh, we got to put up windberries and we got to plant trees, and you go back 10 years later and all the trees are dead and it's not working so well. So I've been trying to basically mimic what nature does and look at like, okay, so we have a lot of willows that grow in certain areas, so I'm going to replant willows in these other areas, and cottonwoods, and I have been kind of planting some like edible bushes and stuff just for little birds and wildlife to come in. But I think I've been very careful of like, I want to make sure that it's based on what is already there. And I want to make sure that it's something that, it's going to maintain itself without me having to be like constantly managing that. So that's kind of been my current model. And then protecting, a big part too is like protecting what's already there, because it is really easy, especially like if you are using, unfortunately, sheep are like little jerks sometimes, and they love to eat baby trees. And so one big part of what I've been working on is just protecting what's already there and making sure that when we are using a pasture that we fence off the trees, and that we're watching the sheep, making sure that they're not putting that pressure on the little trees. And then once the trees are past like a growth point, the sheep can't reach them anymore and they're fine. So you don't have to do it forever because sheep won't eat like the bark or anything, but they definitely will eat the leaves. And so that's kind of been my work right now. And I see progress, but I think I still have a long way to go as far as like being able to see those really obvious changes. But we definitely see like a really wonderful new generation of trees coming in a lot of our property. And so that's making me excited. And then I'm hoping I can maybe do some man-made enhancement in certain areas as well.
I mean, 1% organic matter to 3.6% organic matter in a field. I mean, that is many tens of thousands of extra gallons of water that your soil is holding.
Well, and we've noticed that because one of the things that we're facing, and I know, you will understand this because, the Southwest is really struggling with a very long-term drought. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but I kind of look at climate change and look at what's happening, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So part of resilience is like being smarter with what you already have instead of trying to find other resources. Because I think realistically, we don't have like other water resources to go after. And I think that we should be very careful about doing that anyway, just because I think we can really damage things by trying to be like, oh, we need to, use this water to irrigate or whatever it is. So I really want to figure out a way to live within the limits of what we already have and do a better job with what we already have. And so that field that I was telling you about that we've increased the organic matter on, that's one of the fields that because of lack of water and because of this drought, we just haven't had the water to irrigate it. And so we have a very limited irrigation availability on that field. And what's amazing is it still produces a crop, even though sometimes we'll have to stop irrigating it, say like in maybe June or even May, and that's the last irrigation it will get till the end of the year, and yet it'll still be able to, produce a pasture, produce a crop to harvest. And so I think that's what's amazing about it, and that's where I see the opportunity to show a model of how do we be a little bit more strategic about what we already have. And I think increasing organic matter does really help with water retention in the soil, and so that's my goal, is to show that, this can be done on a farm scale, and it can really help to like reduce water use. It also helps with cleaning up water, right? Because all that organic matter also acts to filter the water and the contaminants that are in it. And so I'm hopeful that that's kind of what I can show through my work. And like I said, I feel like I'm kind of like at the beginning. I mean, we've been doing regenerative work for generations, really, with the river work and all that. But as far as like the soil improvements, I know that I'm kind of starting and need to just keep moving in that direction.
It strikes me, you gave two different examples of, basically the government coming in and saying, we want to do things more efficiently. And then that efficiency turns out not to work because that's not the way nature works. And you're trying to impose a kind of like engineering industrial model on nature. One of them being the leveling the fields and putting all the topsoil on one side, and the other being the river, like straightening a river, which I don't think they're doing that anymore, are they?
No, they are not. I think we are learning, but I will say, and I'm actually on the Colorado Ag Commission, and so I have been trying to use my political voice. I also did go testify in DC in last March. I have been trying to use my voice to remind our policymakers that we need to have an inclusive model, and we really need to think forward. Like we need to think not just today, but we also need to think generations to come, and also including with having inclusive policy that includes minority communities, BIPOC communities is so crucial because we have been very marginalized. Our communities have been very marginalized by policy, and including through some of these programs, because there just hasn't been like that focus on making sure that all ag models are included and that we're doing a really good job of thinking about the long-term consequences. And I'll give you an example of one thing that I'm struggling with right now, and I don't really know how to kind of affect this policy. But for example, I was talking about the efficiency model. So right now, most of the money that you can get through the NRCS and the USDA, and by the way, I have to say I love the programs and farmers really need them. Like we have used them extensively on our farm. They have really helped us do a lot of regenerative work as far as like preserving habitat for insects to make sure that because we have moved our farm to an organic system. And if it hadn't been for those NRCS programs, those USDA programs, we wouldn't have been able to do it because they really helped us to, put compost down on our soils, to basically do our operation differently so that we keep a buffer of plants so that beneficial bugs, like the good bugs, have a place to hide out. And so then when you're done harvesting a field, there's that repopulation of the good bugs, and you don't just have to, that's where pesticide dependence comes in, right? When you spray a pesticide, you kill everything. And so then there just isn't that resilience of a field. And so the NRCS and USDA programs have really helped us create a lot more resilience in our fields, where we've been able to move away from that pesticide use. So I'll just say I really love the programs. And so there's no at all like lack of appreciation. And I've personally benefited. I have a hoop house here on my place that I've been able to grow veggies in. And so they're wonderful programs. But like right now, for example, the main focus is on water efficiency. And so they're basically the old traditional way of irrigating, the acequia systems, were open ditches, which had a lot of loss, so that a lot of water went back into the soil. And then basically people would put them out in these open acequias, and they would dam the acequia, and then the water would flood out into a field. And I was talking about that before because it is a very inefficient system. So they say you get like 60% loss into the groundwater. So of course the NRCS programs are saying, oh, no, this is inefficient use of water. What we really, really need to do is we need to put up more center pivots, which only have like, I think like 5% loss or something like that. So it's a very minimal loss, mostly through evaporation. But what's happened is because the old acequia, the traditional systems, had all those losses, they were actually recharging the aquifer. They were bringing water that was going down into tree roots, into other plants, creating like, really amazing ecosystems around those irrigation systems. And so I think there's definitely like, maybe in one version, it's a bad thing to be inefficient, but in another version, when you really look at the benefits that were happening to the groundwater, to the ecosystem, they were huge. And so I think there's definitely like, how do we look at our water use and think about efficiency, because it is really important, especially since we are in a drought, but also recognize that sometimes inefficiency is a different form of efficiency. And I hope I'm explaining myself well, but I think that's something that I try to remind them of is like, we need to make sure that we preserve some of these traditional ways of farming, because they really, really did really enhance the ecosystem. And I would argue that some of the groundwater issues that we're facing right now is because we have so much less recharge. I mean, people are still pumping at the same levels, but then all of the people who used to be recharging and the rivers that used to be going back into the ground, a lot of the rivers have been dammed, and so there's reservoirs on them, and so the water isn't flowing all year, or just a minimal flow is flowing all year. Our river is completely shut off for most of the winter. And then all those traditional ways of irrigating, where all that water was going back into the groundwater, they're gone, and they've been really pushed aside through policy towards more efficient water use. Including the dams is another example of how money from the government was used in a way that sometimes only benefited certain people. It didn't benefit whole communities, and then it also really was a huge detriment to rivers. Like I said, our river, which is a small river, but it is off from November 1st all the way until March 1st. It's completely turned off, which I think is a really, really sad and definitely not a sustainable model that really looks at, the health of the river, the health of the community, the health of the ecosystem. So I think there's definitely, right. It's a tough one because, the benefit to our farm is huge, and we really appreciate it. We have a really good relationship with our NRCS agency, but then there's also these things where I look at and I go, oh, I really wish that we could look at this a little as a bigger picture, and be very careful about how we implement this model.
Yeah, exactly. Because I guess I think it gets into a perspective shift. Mm-hmm. When you think about efficiency, you're just thinking about one or two dimensions and not the whole sort of holistic picture of what the ecosystem looks like.
Well, and I think what we've done a lot is we've always, there's even that idea of what is a bad weed and what is a good weed. It's a very human-centric model. For example, damming a river and not letting it flow through the winter, that's a human-centric model of then we can use that water for irrigation. And I think that we need a culture shift. We definitely need a culture shift to recognize that we depend on nature. We're not separate. We may perceive ourselves as separate, but we really are really tied to it. And we need to change that attitude of that's that problem and this is our problem, and focus on, if it's nature's problem, it's also our problem. We need to recognize that we are part of that. Hopefully through advocacy and through people having those conversations, there will be a recognition of these other practices that may be more rooted in an ecological system. I know there's work done by the Acequia Association, and I don't know in New Mexico, but this is just in Colorado. And so I know there is being some work to recognize that these systems are different, but it doesn't mean that they're backwards or they're not, hugely beneficial in a bigger worldview, looking kind of less on the human side and more on the ecosystem side.
And I think that's part of, when you talk about representation of BIPOC and non-white, whatever you want to call it, communities, I mean, it's not just the justice of it, because people deserve representation. It's like the actual deep ecosystem knowledge that is lost if communities aren't represented.
Well, and I also think that one thing that I think about a lot, and I am mixed. So, I am, my mom was born in Central and South America, lived there most of her life, but she is mostly Dutch descent. So I'm a little bit of everything, and it's been challenging in a way because I feel like you're never like in a community. You're always kind of like, they know you're a prima, but you're not really like you're, I think there's always been that like dynamic in my life of being on the inside and on the outside, both together. But I think it's given me this unique perspective, and I feel like there definitely needs to be like a little more humble listening. And I think this really applies, like, especially to Indigenous knowledge of we as Westerners have we almost have this acceptance of our culture as a non-culture. Like, we don't have culture. Well, we very, very much have culture. It's just that our culture has kind of indoctrinated us into this idea that because we're a non-culture, that we don't need perspective. And I think that we definitely need to like remind ourselves to always listen and to try to understand that we don't know everything. And in fact, when it comes to environmental stewardship, we really need to listen because that's where we really don't do a good job. And so I think that, I've been reading a lot of books. Braiding Sweetgrass, I know that's just such a wonderful book. And I just think a lot about, these other perspectives, these Indigenous perspectives, these traditional perspectives, and how if we can humble ourselves and listen, there's a lot of teaching to be taught in how to maybe live a little bit more in balance with our environment and to understand our relationship. Because I think it also does come down to relationship. If you have, and I don't want to like trash anything. I was raised in a very Catholic family, but when you have like a Bible that says humanity has dominion over the environment, which means we are like the boss. Versus a lot of Indigenous cultures that have an idea of like, it's more of an equitable system. We are family. It's a familiar relationship. I think that is a very fundamental worldview that changes our relationship and also changes our actions towards our environment. And so I think there's definitely a lot to be learned. If we could listen and just be quiet a little bit more and allow some different perspectives to come in, it might really help us to kind of retrain our way of being within our environment. And we need it. I mean, let's face it, I have 2 small children and I constantly have like, my insomnia is like, are we preserving a future for them? And I would say right now, I can't say yes, because with, climate change, and not just climate change, but also the environmental issues that we're facing, I mean, it is looking really scary. And I just want my kids to have this, we live in a beautiful world, and I want them to be able to experience the way that I was able to experience it. And I think there's like that deep fear of like, what is it going to look like? So I think we have a lot to learn. And I think it is a time for us to maybe step back a little bit and be a little bit more a listener and less of a normalizing our own complicated culture. So that's just something I think about a lot, is that, humility is really an important thing. And I think Western culture, we have struggled with humility.
Yes, that's a very diplomatic way of putting it.
Okay, well, maybe we go even further. And we definitely have, I hate to say this, but our colonizing mentality has not ended with colonization. And I think we've just it's just the form has changed. And now we're using, commercialization and development and all these other terms to be another form of colonization.
You're listening to Down to Earth. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Quivira Coalition's new agrarian program is accepting applications for the 2024 season from November 1st until December 15th, or once all positions are filled. Apprenticeships take place on working ranches and farms practicing regenerative agriculture across the Intermountain West. These 8-month full-time paid apprenticeships include housing and will allow apprentices to be fully immersed in the work of an operation. Program support includes in-person gatherings, an education stipend, educational Zoom calls, one-on-one check-ins, and networking opportunities to kickstart a career in regenerative agriculture. Apprenticeships begin in March and April and run through November 2024. You can learn more at quiviracoalition.org/New Agrarian, and Quivira is Quivira. And now back to our program. Well, let's talk about your farm. I mean, farming is not an easy way to make a living, and you've found ways to make specialty products of various kinds and have really kind of a diverse set of products. Talk about that. Tell us what it looks like.
Yeah, so it is tough to be a farmer. I think that's one of the fears that my dad had when I told him I was going to come back and be a farmer. So I was laughing because at the Quivira Coalition thing, I was put in a room called Scaling Up, and I was like, I'm really not into scaling up, you know? I actually, anyway, we'll go back to what we were talking about, but like,
no, talk about that.
Well, I think there's like this culture, and it is really tough to fight it because it is where the economics are of like get big or get out. That is like what ag is about right now. And I think that's why you see the age of farmers is increasing, family farms are diminishing. And a lot of it is because the economics of like, you have to make a choice. You have to like really be a go-getter, acquire more land, acquire more acreage, more head, more cows, more sheep, whatever it is in order to be competitive. And I just don't want to. I don't want to. And I really would like to be, I always think of the analogy of like a big fish in the ocean and how it's moving around versus like a little minnow. And I would rather be the little minnow. I mean, I think that allows you to switch directions quicker. I think we need that for resilience, you know, looking towards the future. I think we need both. Of course, I'm not saying that we don't need the big players. But I didn't want to be one. So I worked really hard to think about how could I do more with less. And so I'm still trying to improve that. I think I have still some improvements to make on that. But basically, I tried to turn like one animal to be as much as it could, you know, and I think that's also like a respect of the life of the animal as well. Looking at an animal and seeing that each part of it is something to be honored. So that includes like when I butcher an animal, I go pick up the pelt and then I sell the pelt. I get it cured and made into a piece of leather. You know, then the wool off that animal when we shear them, which is a totally humane and very important process for animals. So once we shear them, then I take that fleece and then I try to do whatever I can to make each fleece count. So I make yarn or I make roving, or right now I'm working on some rugs. And so trying to make a final product that makes each animal kind of have its story. That's what I've tried to do. And I think the other part of the sheep business too is like the manure. So the soil improvement part, which is not monetary, but it is definitely improving and enhancing the farm. So that's what I've kind of been working on, is like basically trying to make each animal count for more. And so that I don't have to have so many animals, and that I can actually have a smaller farm and still make a living off of it. So right now, as I take over the farm, we are downsizing the acreage that we run. I've also downsized the number of sheep that I have. And so that's kind of what I've been working on. And I still have a long way to go, especially like in the meat part. I probably could maximize that part a little bit better. So I'm just kind of trying to maximize what I already have, if that makes sense. And I think farming is really tough no matter what you do. I know a lot of farmers really struggle. I think it's a common thing for farms to struggle financially. So, which is another thing that is a shame, because that's our food, that's our clothing. I mean, those are really, really important services that farmers are offering. And it is a really tough thing about our economic system, that they are really much at the bottom of an economic totem pole.
I really appreciate what you are saying about it's not about getting big, but about really maximizing what you have, because it just seems like it's respectful to the earth, to the animals, and to a realistic assessment of how much time and energy a small operation has.
Yeah, totally. I just don't want to get into the situation where I'm like having, like, I just become a manager. I love to still be on the ground and messing with the animals and being able to look at them and enjoy them. And I'm not at the point where sometimes I wish I was. I almost sometimes wish I was even smaller, but I'm not at the point where every sheep has a name. They still have numbers, but I really love that I can remember them. I'm like, oh, that's the one that had twins last year, and that's the one that, she was such a sweet mom, or that she helped me with this. And so I think that I love that I can look at my sheep and I can still have that relationship with them and understand, they're not just like, those are the sheep, we're separate. And so I love that my life can be a little bit more tied to the actual identity and life of each animal, because they do have a personality, each of them. And I think that's really fun, that I don't want to get to that point where they just are the sheep. and sometimes they do get names, mostly the outliers, bratty ones, or the ones that did something bad, or, the deformed ones, like the ones that kind of have something wrong with them. They're the ones that get the names. So there are a few that have names, and normally they're not very complimentary, but they are at least amusing. Yeah.
Talk more about the wool. You don't sell finished products like wool blankets and things like that, but you do sell the wool in various stages of finishedness. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, so I've been really fortunate to have some very wonderful companies. They're family-owned small businesses that I've kind of partnered with, and they do a lot of that processing for me. People ask me often, like, do you make this yarn? And I'm like, if I made that yarn, I would not be here, because I'd be inside trying to process all these pieces of wool, and it would be a full-time job. So I have a family-owned mill out of Craig, Colorado, and they do most of my wool processing. So they do roving, which is like cleaned and carded, and it can be spun or it can be felted. It's basically kind of like it's not a product that you could like make something out of, but it's something you could make something out of to make something out of. So it's kind of two steps back. And they do all that for me. And then they also do some beautiful yarn. So one thing I've been really working on is, because, the textile industry uses a ton of water to make their products. And one of the reasons they use so much water is the dyeing process. And so one of the things I've been working on is, first of all, using more natural dyes, which still do use a lot of water, but they're plant-based. So I think that's really exciting. And then also basically trying to breed sheep that have unique colors, so that way I can offer like a yarn, for example, that there's different shades of gray, there's different shades of brown, and you don't have that water involved in the dyeing process, because it is its own color without dyes. And so I think that's been really fun for me to kind of experiment. And that's kind of like on the genetic side of basically like, there's a brown sheep. Let's try breeding a brown sheep and a gray sheep and see what we get. And so that's the fun part for me, is kind of being able to experiment and see what comes out of certain genetic crosses. And in the industry, people do not like black sheep. It's so funny, because like when I go to other farms, they're like, oh yeah, we got a black sheep. They're going to sell that lamb, probably because black wool is worth so much less in the more industrial wool department. But for me, a black sheep is like, ooh, there's a black one or a gray one. And so my sheep, you see often sheep out in a field, they're mostly white. Mine are all kinds of different colors. And I think that's been really fun for me to kind of experiment with color. And I love the connection between art and livestock and ranching and textiles. And so I love how those all connect. So that's what I've been working on, is those sorts of products. And then the other product that I love to carry, is, I talked about that a little bit, is the pelts. So when you butcher an animal, normally what butchers do is they actually skin the animal, and then that skin goes into their pit where they put like maybe the guts and the stomachs and all that sort of stuff. It's a waste product. And that broke my heart, because here I am breeding these beautiful wool animals, and we do eat them because, that is also part of the relationship, especially wethers. So like males that are castrated, I can't keep everything. If I did, I would degrade my environment. I would degrade my ecosystem. My whole farm would be overgrazed. And so, certain ones don't get to stay, unfortunately. And, it broke my heart to think I'm taking this beautiful animal to the butcher, and I am getting meat and selling whole and half lambs. I'm eating it myself, which is a really important thing, because that's kind of how I live off the farm. And then they're throwing this gorgeous pelt into a pit. And so I have luckily been able to create relationships with my butchers where they save those pelts, and then I get them cured and turned into leather. And they're beautiful. And I also think it's really an important part of honoring the life of an animal and making sure that, like, I think one of my friends said, about butchering. She said, the day you feel ambiguous about it is the day you need to quit. And I think as a rancher, that's like one of my worst days, is loading up my lambs to go to slaughter. But then knowing that I did everything I could to honor that life makes me feel a little bit better, even if it is still it's a tough relationship, and it is something that is really hard for me to do. So I think that's kind of where I've added value on my animals, and then also with the wool products. And I don't have finished products simply because that's just not where my passion lies, I suppose. Is I'm not a fashion person. I don't really understand fashion. And so I felt like maybe I don't want to go into the wearable department, because I feel like you have to have like a different skill set. But I really love to be part of people's clothing journey. A lot of people are buying, oftentimes people will buy a raw fleece all the way fresh from the sheep, and they'll actually like make their own sweater out of that. And I just love that story, and that I get to be a part of that story. And so maybe more than like, oh, I made this sweater and then a person wore it. I love the story of like, I sold them this wool and then they made a sweater and then they wore it. And so I think that's where I get excited about, especially when people really like what I have, or they like the color, or they think it's, oh, this is so soft, this is so beautiful. It's like more of the art side and less of the fashion side. So that's right. Kind of how I've decided to do my business.
I love the idea of breeding the animals for the colors of their wool. I guess I never really thought about that, because that natural wool, those kind of browns and all different shades of like beige and light brown, can be so beautiful.
Yeah, and I love them. Like, maybe this is like where my secret Puritan side, no, I'm not really, but I think this is like my weird brain, but to me, gray is like this beautiful thing to wear. And so I love the fact that, I could make a sweater that's like the actual color of the animal, and less of like, oh, they added this dye and they did that. And it's funny because I'm not the only one. A lot of customers will be like, I want a black yarn, but I don't want a dyed black yarn. I want a black yarn. And it's actually like ironically very hard to get a true black, because no matter what you do, the sun bleaches the tips of the wool, and then they're just black is just really hard to get. And so like one of my goals is always like, how do we get a black sheep, like truly black? Because they tend to be a little bit gray or a little bit brown, and not like that true black. Because you can also play with those colors after, like for example, if you take a light gray and then you over dye it with a yellow, say like you use a plant dye, especially yellows are really easy to get with plant dyes. So you can get a really beautiful green, because gray with yellow turns green. And so it can be really fun, especially even as you go down into other colors, if you have like a natural color wool. And so that's probably what I'm most proud of, is when I have these beautiful different tones within my fleeces and within my yarns. That makes me really happy, and people get excited about it too, and I get excited about it too, because I do really like those colors. And even white, a lot of our textile industry, especially like wool and cotton, they bleach everything, and so everything is white. Like, we're used to a white that is truly white. And actually, if you take the original color of wool, it's really more of a cream color, and it's actually a very beautiful color on its own. And so I love that, since I'm using these small businesses, they're not using bleach, they're not whitening the wool, you get like this really lovely creamy color, and it's not white. And so I think that's something else that I really enjoy is, white is very hard to accomplish in the natural world. And so that creamy is much prettier to me than a white.
Well, and that's another place where it would be nice if our aesthetics would shift. I mean, it's the same thing with paper. I don't need, like, I just printed out something this morning and it's like, I don't need pure white paper or a pure white t-shirt or any of that. It's like, it'd be so nice to have the option to have all of the things that we use be that sort of more natural creamy color.
Well, I mean, we've done this with everything, right? Sugar, bleached flour, bleached sugar, bleached clothing. Why are we bleaching toilet paper? Like, I'm sorry, this is like way TMI, but you're going to use it to go to the bathroom. Like, why are you bleaching this product? I don't know where that came from, but I think it came from the idea of like clean is white. Okay, yes, maybe it is clean, but what it's done to the environment and all those bleach products and all those other products that have come out of it are really like not benefiting humanity. They're not benefiting the environment. And so maybe there's, if we could change our idea of like what a beautiful color is, And like, to me, if you look at those earth tones, if you look at those colors that can be acquired from plant dyeing and then also the natural colors of the sheep, they are very stunning, but they aren't like bright neon green. You know what I mean? They're subdued and they're a lot calmer, but I do think they're beautiful colors. And I think that would be wonderful. And I know there is a lot of movements in the textile industry to really bring back, some of these traditions. And I never argue that we should go back because, oh my gosh, women were traded as property, like people were traded as property, like it's horrible. We don't want to go back, but we can also look at the past and see, what were things that people were doing that were really in tune with their environment, in tune with their ecosystem, in tune with their ag systems, to wear clothing, to eat food, and how can we maybe recreate some of these in the modern world where we do really need to address our environmental footprint.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about not going back, because it's so easy to romanticize times gone by when you don't think about the details.
Oh, I know. Well, I think about myself as like, even in this era, being a woman in ag, I mean, you still have to deal with the stuff, there's still like that, you can't do this because, and I've lost jobs in the ag world because I was a woman, not because I did a bad job, not because I wasn't following through, but literally the guy told me once, well, we don't want to hire you anymore because you're a woman and we just don't think you can do this job. And I was like, but I did it for 5 years and you didn't have any complaints. And so I think that there is still that culture. And I think going back, absolutely not. As a woman, I don't want to go back there. I think that we have done a lot of good as far as fighting for LGBT rights, and we have a long way to go with that. And same with women's rights. We still have a long way to go. Minorities, BIPOC communities. I mean, we are moving in a good direction in those things. We definitely don't want to go backwards. But I think also to understand that, like, we do need to address certain things. And a lot of traditions about food and fiber traditionally were based on an ecosystem approach. What are you growing in your area? What grows well? And then how do you turn that into clothing? How do you turn that into food? And so I think that there are definitely those lessons to be learned. But careful not to say, let's go back, because I don't want to go back to. No way. Yeah, I think the modern world also brings so many really good things, like, our being able to connect with other communities, through the internet. And there's really some beautiful things that are happening today.
And that's what I think makes this moment that we're in so complicated, because it's impossible to really say, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, because the industrial system that allows for so much more communication than we've ever had and so much more opportunity of all different kinds. But at the same time, let's look at the food industry, the industrial food industry. That's what this show is about, and how it's killing the earth. And it seems like it's almost exactly analogous to the fiber industry, where, things like clothing and blankets and sheets and all that stuff, it's very much part of the industrial model. And it's just so mixed. I mean, I was looking, it's like, okay, I have a fleece, what would you call it? Petroleum fleece blanket on my bed. Well, you get really sweaty under those things.
Right.
But, I don't have a wool blanket, so I'd like to go buy a wool blanket. If I want to buy a New Mexico wool blanket, that's going to cost me $400, whereas the fleece one is going to cost me $35. So, more people are warm because of these things. But, let's talk about the downside of the industrial clothing and fiber model. You started talking about water, but there's also, there's water, there's pollution, there's all kinds of climate implications. What are you seeing in the clothing and fiber industry?
Yeah, and I love where I am because I really am still in the ag industry, but I can look at the fiber industry, or like the textile industry, and kind of just have that a little bit of more of an outside perspective. But basically, and I'm going to say I don't have all the statistics, but Google will tell you all the statistics because they're horrible. But basically, at this point, 20% of water pollution is through the textile industry. And actually, it is one of the higher water use areas of ag is the textile industry. And then you're looking at petroleum products, which is all your polyesters and all your basically, a lot of what we're wearing is a petroleum product. And, that I don't have to explain because it's literally an oil product. And we're trying to get away from fossil fuels. We're looking that, we are seeing these policies coming down through with electric vehicles. And I think that's really wonderful. But we have to look at, it's kind of like the plastic thing, right? Like we are looking at how we use plastic. And I think that has to happen. I mean, you look at these marine ecosystems, it's absolutely horrible. But another plastic product that we are wearing every single day is these polyester products. And so I think there's definitely, we need to have that conversation, and clothing needs to be included because it is part of the problem. And I think that, you also add the social part, right? Where you have, you have supply chains, and I can only speak about the wool industry a little bit, but I know that most of these industries are very similar. But you have, for example, right now, American wool grown in the States, shipped to China to be turned into whatever, then shipped to maybe another country, Indonesia, somewhere like that, and then shipped back to the United States as a finished product. I mean, this is an absolutely inefficient supply chain. And also really ties into the social part of we talked about, and we all know about the sweatshops, the human rights violations that have happened through the textile industry. And so unfortunately, when you have a supply chain that is that convoluted, it's really easy for those things to happen because no one knows, and I see the fast fashion industry, I don't think it's gotten better. You see these new promotions like $3 shirts, and they're all polyester. And then you're asking yourself, okay, if it's a $3 shirt, how did that get made for $3? You know that something is being missed, whether it's labor, wages, whether it's fair and safe places for workers, whether it's the environmental side of how the product is made. I mean, there's just so many questions that come into my mind when I see these these super cheap clothing, fast fashion. That's a huge issue, and it has a global impact. The textile industry is a huge polluter, and unfortunately, a lot of that pollution happens in countries where they don't have regulations. A lot of dyes are carcinogenic. They're very dangerous for people. They're very dangerous for water systems. There's no control, especially a lot of these countries where most of the textile industry is, I'm talking about the big stuff is going on. There aren't those regulations to protect people, to protect the environment. And so, anyway, it's a mess. The tough part is, how do you, when somebody is, especially we have issues with distribution in our whole world. And so how do you argue okay, so you can barely buy food and you need to go buy an $80 sweater. You know what I mean? I think there is definitely that social part too on the consumer side. And I've thought about this a lot, and I've thought about, and this is where I don't want to go back, but this is where I do think about fiber traditions in the past. And one of the things that traditionally people did was they owned a lot less clothing, and clothing was a lot higher quality. And then once it was used for one thing, it was reused for another. And so even though the resources put into each article of clothing was much higher, because, historically people had tailored clothing, each yard of fabric was hand woven or hand knitted. And so, you have a lot more human investment into that product. The quality is that much higher. And then also the longevity of that article is much longer. And so you don't have to invest in, every year you have to buy a new shirt, and, you're using something more for a lifetime, and then they get handed down. I think that's a culture shift. I think we are very much on the trend of fast fashion. I remember being younger, and there was always oh yeah, are you wearing the I was so a 90s 2000 the platforms and all the and I think that there's that cultural side of we are trying to keep up. A lot of our clothes disposal isn't based on use, it's done, it's been used and it has holes in it or it needs to go. It's a lot of the time it's based on fashion, and I think that's going to take the fashion industry, I think, owning a little bit more of their influence. I mean, I'm not sure I'm into that battle, but in my little tiny way, at least, I'm trying to say, we need to slow down. And I think that's generally, we need to slow down and we need to ask more questions. These are really big problems. And I think, a lot of the social side too, and maybe it's because I came from this mixed background, but clothing was also not just an identity of how cool you are and are you keeping up, but also a cultural identity. And I think that what we've seen is through this commercialization and industrialization of the clothing industry, we've also seen that really be marginalized, where you see indigenous cultures and traditional cultures who have their textile culture and their apparel culture basically kind of being converted into this what's cool, oh Nike, oh this, and the name brands, and less focused on those more traditional ways of wearing clothing. And so I think it's amazing. I have so much respect for some of the cultures that have managed to keep on that. I've been able to travel a little bit, and I've been able to see it in different parts of the world, but when I was in Guatemala, for example, they still have that beautiful weaving tradition, but you definitely see, the next generation does not want to wear the traditional clothing. They want to wear, the cool stuff. And so I don't know how to solve it, but I do think there's also that culture side of like how we have taken traditions and identities and turned them into more of like a generic, what is cool. And I think the media has a big role in that. And I think that, how we present what is trendy and what is cool, definitely has very serious repercussions on a global, in a global scale. So yeah, I don't have a solution. I just see a lot of some of the problems. And I think this comes down to like how we talk about tradition and how we talk about this knowledge, this other way of knowing. And how do we, instead of making those other ways of knowing backwards, or how do we respect them and honor them and recognize the deep value that they have? They're based on sound knowledge. And I think, I come from like more of a science background. And one of the things that I always like would go crazy with the science world is like, they're very like, oh, science is like the solution. And it's like, well, we don't know everything. And understanding that sometimes tradition and sometimes indigenous knowledge is based on almost a deeper understanding than we can get from science, because science can be very reductionist. And it's not based on like the whole picture. So anyway, science and society and textiles, like in my mind, they're all like kind of blending in together, I guess. Yeah.
Well, and there's this, people losing their traditional identities. I mean, there are places in Latin America where you can identify where somebody comes from because of the way they make their clothing and the particular forms of embroidery on it and so on. And that's lost, or can get lost pretty quickly. But then at the same time, you've got wealthy people who are saying, no, we want to keep those things. And so you'll have wealthy ladies in Santa Fe wearing that clothing that the people in Guatemala maybe aren't wearing. I mean, it's just a kind of huge, fascinating mess right now. And yeah, I mean, nobody has the answers because we're in a continual state of flow that's based on economic realities that are far bigger than any of us.
Yeah, and I don't like, solution wise, I think about this a lot as like, what would be a solution? Because I think we're seeing this not just with textiles, but also with like language. I have a friend who did her PhD on basically how languages are reflected in digital media and how, we're losing, not just through culture, because like some languages are going extinct and there are very few people who preserve those languages, but also just like how we do things on a bigger scale. What are the languages that we represent in our media, and how that can like marginalize these languages that are going extinct. And with language, language and culture are not the same, obviously, but they are really connected. And so as you lose language, you also lose culture, which I think is they're both together. And as you lose culture, you lose language. It is a really tough one. Some of the things I think about a lot, and I don't have like I said, this is where it gets very existential and I don't have the solutions, but I think we tend to think like, oh, capitalism is like the way that you have to do things. Like I've even heard like people say like, this is the common sense solution. And if you really think of the history of the world, there have been other systems other than capitalism. Like, have they been great? Not always. They've had their own problems. You've had feudalism and imperialism, and we've had all these systems that were different and also had problems. And I think that if we can take a little bit of a bigger picture and understand that like capitalism is a system, it is not the only system, and it has problems. I mean, some of the problems are the social side of like consumerism has undermined a lot of cultures. We have done horrible things to the planet. We have done horrible things to people. And I think when maximizing profit is the bottom line, it really is just very, very hard to do things for other reasons. That is one of the biggest things that I have to say about why our economic system doesn't work, is because the focus is maximizing profit and growth. And that's another thing. It's like we live in a planet that is literally like a little spaceship in the middle of nowhere. And growth is a model that demands that there's something that's going to get bigger, that there's more, and there's going to be more, and there's going to be more. But we live in a finite system. And so growth is a model that I think really lacks foresight. And it also doesn't acknowledge how well people are actually doing. Just because you have economic growth doesn't mean that you have people who are happier, healthier, living more fulfilled lives. In fact, I think we can see that in our own culture. Just because our economy is doing so well, it doesn't mean that the average person is doing so well. And it doesn't mean that we're living like a happy, fulfilled life. And I think those things need to be disconnected. Like I used to be working, when I started my degree, I was doing development work. And that was one of my big struggles with it, was like focused on GDP. How do we get developing countries to have a higher GDP? But GDP doesn't actually measure how well people are doing. It's just how much goods and money is being exchanged. It has nothing to do with, are your people happy? And I think, we have seen these new reports of like the gross happiness index and all these come out that have showed that some of the countries that their GDP isn't as high are actually a lot happier. And so I don't know how to solve all this, but these are some of the things that I think about when we talk about capitalism and we talk about consumerism. Is it really the system that is really bringing us the most fulfilled life? And also, is it a system that is really based in logic, in an ecological system? And I think that if you take out the fact that we live on the planet and you can pretend that we live in, like this perfect expandable world, sure, growth is a great model, but when you really think about a finite system, a closed system, growth is a model that really, it has a dead end, and the dead end is not a good one.
Let's go back to your farm. You are producing sheep, and for meat and for wool, and the wool is in various stages and it gets sold to various other businesses who then eventually make finished things. But you're also doing grains and hay and other kinds of, crops of different kinds. Tell us about that.
So, one thing that I've learned, and as I've watched our farm, is recognizing that it's really important to have diverse industries on a business, because things can go wrong very easily in an ag system. And I think that's one thing that I've learned is, having several products that if, for example, you have a really bad year with the sheep. One year we had a bacterial outbreak and we lost a lot of lambs. And so that year, it's always nice to have something that is there that can back you up. And so that's where the hay and the grain have come in. The grain has been a little bit of an experiment that we'll see where it goes. It's more of my dad's project. But basically, it's just been kind of the processing side has been a little harder, because the neat thing about the wool industry is that there are like these micro mills that can do like small batch yarn and all this sort of fun stuff. But in the grain world, it's a little harder to find that. So yeah, I think we're always a little bit experimenting and learning. And I think that it's important, like with, like if you look at crop rotations, they're so important to keep your soil healthy. And so it's nice to have the grains come in because they're the annuals. And then you can follow that with like a hay crop, an alfalfa crop, which has a lot of nitrogen. And since grain needs more nitrogen, it uses up that nitrogen. So that's kind of how we've run the farm, with like these crop rotations that are really based on, not having to apply fertilizer, using what the plants are creating on their own. Because, alfalfa is a great plant. It does use more water than it should, unfortunately, but it does fix nitrogen. And so it can really help with the soil health part.
You've got 2 small children. I know they're very young, but are you teaching them what you do? Are you kind of like hoping that they carry on the business?
Yeah, with my kids, I don't want to make them be anything I want them to be what they want to be. I really believe that I love them and I want them to be able to follow their own path. But they do love to help. And actually, now my 3-year-old is old enough where she kind of gets what's going on. And so it's so funny because she'll haul this big old bucket. I can do it, Mom. I can do it. And she'll help me. She really wants to be out there. I'll be like, hey, honey, I'll be right back. No, I want to go with you. And so she really loves to go out there. And I think growing up on a farm is such a blessing because they do have, so much time outside, but then also they get to see, like we grow this big vegetable garden, and then that's like one of my favorite things, to go get dinner ready and we go pick whatever we're going to eat for dinner that night, and she gets to pick what it is. And so I think that, there's these wonderful lessons that are there, and also just a lifestyle that is, it's a really wonderful lifestyle. Now, it can be dangerous. Last year, a ewe ran over the 3-year-old, and that was horrible. and then she was very scared of the sheep for a little while there, but she's getting over that now. So I'm hopeful that maybe this coming year, when we bring the sheep in for lambing, she can get over that fear, because it was so, poor thing, she was so betrayed that sheep just thought, oh, this is a threat, I'm gonna run her over. But she's okay. But it was definitely not a great moment for her.
What are your hopes for the future of your farm and your business?
I think one of my main goals is I just want to be able to show these tangible changes in the soil health, and then also showing how that applies to water use, because I do think like that's where we are right now in the West, is how do we go forward with less water. And so I'm really excited to see how far that can take me, and if I'm going to be able to show that. In the future, I would really love, and I always talk about this, but I know I'm not there yet, but I would really love my farm to be able to offer more of educational opportunities, whether that's through classes or having some interns. But that is my goal for the future, and I'm not there yet. I did have a intern this year and recognized that I was not there yet, but I will be eventually. And so I think that would be really a fun goal, is to be able to, have these conversations on the farm level, and maybe able to bring in some other voices too through, maybe doing some classes or something like that. But I have a lot to do. I mean, I live in like this really rundown house, and I have to fix it first, and I need to kind of build some infrastructure on the farm as well. And so I recognize that I'm not there yet, but eventually.
Elena Miller Ter-Kuile, thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also, please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show, and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.